Welcome to all to the webinar series of Educational Research Department of Lancaster University. My name is Melis Jin. I'm a lecturer in Education and Social Justice, and I'm delighted to chair this session by Dr. Gunjan Sondhi today. The seminar is being live streamed for off-campus postgraduate students, staff, and other interested people who can ask questions at the end of the presentation using their computer audio or via the chat box. The session will also be recorded, and the recording will be available on the department's website. Before I introduce our speaker, can I just ask everyone to switch off their camera and mute their microphone during the presentation? Thank you so much for this. And today we're hosting Gunjan Sondhi from the Open University. She is lecturer in geography, and her research interests focus on the interplay between gender, class, education, and skilled mobility. She'll be talking around 40 to 45 minutes, and then we'll have around 15 to 20 minutes question and answer session. So over to you, Gunjan.
Great, thank you so very much for that, Melis, and thank you to Kimmy and Rebecca and Dee as well, and Melis, of course, for inviting me to present and an opportunity to really try and think through some of the work that we've done over the last year on international students, and particularly international students during the pandemic. It's been an interesting experience in lots of ways, as it has been for lots of people in very different ways. But this is something that this isn't in any way a new project that we're doing. While the take on this project, which is the experiences with international students from during the period of COVID and the pandemic, is a particular take into this, but the work on international students broadly and the discussion that we're going to have today around the infrastructures of mobility, and this notion of how the students are in fact stuck, or how do they come to be stuck, and the differential mobilities has been an ongoing conversation, in my works in the past 10 years, starting from my PhD onwards to now, but also I guess recently, sort of the key point of inflection would be around 2017, where in conversation with Professor Parvati Raghuram, who's at the Open University in geography as well, we produced we submitted a statement to the UN Global Compact for one of the informal sessions. And we submitted a statement which is called Student Migration and Negative Remittances within the context of development at that time. And in that statement, what we had in fact said was that there are three sort of invisible components to international student migration. It's not just the international education, which is the knowledge transfers or the movement of the body of the students themselves, which need to be governed and navigated, but it also needs to take into account things like the financial transfers, which with migration literature, the ideas of remittances and financial transfers are very key. But with international student migration, they're often, they're not as prominent of a discussion. They've always remained sort of underlying it. They're mentioned as fees, but they're not really seen as financial transfers, or what we refer to them in that one-page statement as negative remittances. So rather than saying that people go abroad or they're migrating for work and then they send money back home, with international students, there is an upfront discussion or an upfront recognition. There needs to be a recognition that there are a whole host of costs. In addition to the usual migration costs, there's an additional cost that international students incur, which is the tuition fees, which is the room and board, and all the money that's in fact injected into the economy of the receiving country. And yet that's always been sort of on the back burner or discussed implicitly as fees or indirect and direct costs, but never explicitly. And really it's taken this pandemic and to bring that forward, to bring that to the fore, to highlight the implications and the volume of the money that's transferred and the infrastructure around it. And so what the pandemic's allowed us to do is really think about international students, not just as migrants moving in, not just in the context of education, but really the broader frames and structures in which these processes occur. And particularly the infrastructures as they relate to migration, which is the movement of the people, and the governance structures and infrastructure that exists there. but also the infrastructure of finance, because that in itself has its own systems and technologies and processes that differentially enable people to move, because it's the ability of the money to move as well that needs to be taken into consideration. And lastly, there is the actual knowledge transfers, or the mobility of the knowledge and knowledge infrastructures, which isn't just the HEIs, but also all the other things and structures, or rather technologies and processes and governance, intermediaries that we have to think about that come into play. So really that's what COVID has allowed us to do, is really bring as a point of crisis, and really this is referring to Stuart Hall and Doreen Massey's work, where COVID as a crisis and as a conjuncture is not just a crisis in itself, but is an opportunity that highlights what are the existing gaps in the infrastructures, what are the existing gaps and challenges. And while they might have been implicit, as we said, around the finance issues of international students, they may have been hidden, they may have been invisible in the past, but the crisis sort of brings them to the top. And for international students, or in relation to international students, that issue of finance came to light because things like the universities, and particularly higher education institutions in the UK, all of a sudden making statements saying, we may have to close down programs, we may have to make cuts, our income is going to be impacted because international students' fees and the money coming in through international students is not going to be there. And that in itself is a crisis. And that generated a whole host of reports, starting from March 2020, by London Economics and different groups, starting from March 2020, and then June, and then September, and then regular updates. And so we came into this project, or rather we ended up in a way in a position to undertake this project, because in 2019, we had already started thinking about things around fees, which, in 2017, we had started thinking about negative remittances and finance and fees, which has been an ongoing conversation, and then starting to actually develop a project around international students and fees and building those grant proposals in. And in 2019, we decided we would do a pilot, which we managed to get some internal funds for from the Open University. In January 2020 is when we found out we would have the internal funds. And just as we were about to start thinking and developing, actually operationalizing and trying to just collecting CVs for RAs is when we had the lockdown. And so everything just got shelved briefly. But it didn't take long, to realize the implications that and the impact that the lockdown was having already on international student mobilities. So we've used this term, Parvati and I, we've published a blog in May last year because we were invited to, as part of a migration group of people thinking about the impact of COVID and migration. And we really thought through as to what these kind of mobilities were happening, which was delayed and disrupted and disabled. So there were students who were able to move, there were students who weren't able to move, or students who just were stuck, as we, at that time we called it being stuck in the middle of a pandemic. But it also meant that students might have to delay, or they were being required or expected to be in some places, international students, and then they just couldn't be. They were trying to be in all these various migration infrastructures that were there, but they couldn't be. And that's what slowly highlighted the different failures in the infrastructures that were happening. And we had to do a lot of this research. Well, we had to do the research, as a lot of us are doing, at a distance, which has a particular connotation being at the OU because it's a distance education institution. But it also meant, as we were doing the research, that it required different considerations from us as the people who were undertaking the research, who were doing the interviews, who were asking these questions, which we can reflect upon, or if people have questions more so on that around recruitment and the practicalities, but also the ethics of doing the research during the pandemic. We can discuss that moving forward as well. But coming back to the question of this project as we designed it in the middle of lockdowns, because we didn't know when we were going to open up. We couldn't even, in fact, if we had said that we would do these interviews in person, we wouldn't have gotten ethics approval. We did do what we've always done, which is what Parvati and I, Parvati has done in her projects, I've done in my project separately, but in the projects we work together as well, which is really just drawn mixed methods and set up the online survey and set up online interviews. Having done multiple online surveys, we already had a set of questions, but we worked in partnership with UKISA to develop this particular survey. and it ran from 1st of August to 15th of October. So it wasn't very large. And we used various channels to circulate enough of an, to make sure that there was enough of an interest, enough of a response. And we had about 85 respondents. 60% of them were women, 40% were people who identified as non-binary, and then men. And as I've said, I've clustered the non-binary and men together because the non-binary group was really relatively small. So just to maintain for data privacy purposes. And then the online interviews, we had 10 respondents, and these respondents were recruited from the survey. So rather than doing these things in parallel, we really did them in serial, and really trying to get as much diversity as we could with those 10 respondents, knowing that we were limited by time, but also the stress and the time commitment we were asking from our respondents as well, because it did require them to really think about the period of lockdown that they had gone through. And in some cases, these were traumatic experiences. In other cases, they were relatively less traumatic. So as a researcher, there was a responsibility for us to really think through is, not to push people too much. If someone had responded, follow up once or twice, but really not be as pushy as we might have been in following up in some of the respondents. And these were done over Teams and Zoom. And in these conversations, these conversations really highlighted those gaps that we had already identified in the survey, that we were already seeing in the news. But in these conversations, it's highlighted in the ways that these things were entangled, but at the same time, some of the different components in which the way the infrastructures and the structures worked, that they in fact, despite being entangled, the complexities and entanglements were where the gaps were occurring, because people had access to information and they had knowledge, but when it came to operationalizing and using and actually being able to do something with that information, people were, not being able to do anything because the other processes around them were falling apart. So with respect to migration, there were people who were stuck within the UK. There were people who were trying to come into the UK because they had gone home over Christmas to their respective countries, and now they were trying to come back in and they couldn't. Even if UK was allowing them in their respective countries, they couldn't actually fly out. Even if there were no restrictions, the flights had been cancelled. So there was a whole host of barriers to being able to move into the UK or move out of the UK to go visit. So there were travel issues. Then for those who might have been coming into the UK to start new courses couldn't, because Office of the Visa offices were closed in other countries. They may still be open in the UK, but they might have been closed then. Universities had to think of various different, people were asking universities as to what were the visa statuses. And the visas became really crucial because they are tied to your attendance. So as we know, universities themselves are now playing a very intricate, complex role in the visa processes and the migration processes, in that they now are in effect border agents because they have to monitor the presence and absences of students. And so one of the questions that we asked the respondents were, well, you've chosen to stay in the UK. Is this actually a choice? Are you stuck in the UK? Or, all the, whether you wanted to leave. And this is again, bearing in mind in August. So as we were coming out of lockdown coming out of the first lockdown. And really what the majority have said is that they do wanted to, and they needed to return, but because of pandemic relations, they were forced to travel. They were forced to cancel their plans. And the largest group chose not to return home because in those early parts, everyone, the information that was coming, A, there was no information being given, and B, when the information was being given, this is temporary, right? No one had anticipated how long this might last or what would go on. And so the uncertainties around that meant that a lot of students felt, well, it's okay, we'll just stay here, and are choosing not to return or not to travel at that point. But really, the second largest group being wanting to return and not being able to because they couldn't get the flights out, the flights were being cancelled. But then a lot of issues came around. Well, how will it impact my ability to come back into the country? How will it impact my ability to undertake my studies and complete my studies? Because a lot of money has been invested in international education, studying in the UK, besides tuitions, the indirect costs of just living and housing, everything else has implications. So how does the visa migration issues then impact the studies? And in this case, the majority of the primary concern that people had was not being able to meet the face-to-face study requirements. So everything's online. And this is, of course, not a big surprise to anyone, right? We are a year on from the lockdown, and the key issue around face-to-face requirements of the visa categories were one of the earliest ones to be restricted. But that also has implications in the value and the qualifications that are then received. Because in lots of other countries or for other employers, online education is not considered acceptable education. And so if the idea is to get international education, go abroad and study and then get jobs elsewhere, and you may not still be able to get those jobs because all of a sudden your education, even whether it's an LSE, SOAS, or one of the smaller universities in the UK, is now online. And that becomes questions. And what the implications of that are yet to be examined. So what it raises, apologies. So what it raises, all of a sudden you have this idea of the migration, which is visa policies and processes that need to be considered immediately. But it also then is linked to, the quality of the education, the value of the education, and the recognition of the education of just studying and learning at a distance, which of course, from the perspective of the universities and all of us who've had to transition, well, slightly different at the OU because we never really had to transition, being distance education. But for majority of traditional universities, this required a massive shift, a massive effort on the individual's part, particularly the lecturers. But it also meant that there is an impact on students, particularly international students. Excuse me. And one of the impacts of that is the immediate impact was that the students felt that the studies were slowed down. And that's particularly for undergraduate and master's level, but then for PhD and for those who are undertaking research masters, that they were being unable to actually be able to carry out their research. And so for a lot of students, again, this issue of not just simply deferring their studies, but actually being unable to do their work, move forward, which depending on whether you're looking at undergraduate or master's or PhD has different implications. Again, these are not new, for everyone sitting in the room, you've had to deal with these either individually or with your students, or you would have heard your friends and colleagues who would have gone through this, these experiences, or yourself. So this isn't necessarily new or different information. And in this regard, the experiences of international students and home students are also not very different in this, right? There are the similar concerns, yet the implications of this are significant for international students because they're in the UK within the framework of as international migrants. So they have visa restrictions and limitations, which, as we've already said, was a big concern, but now it's linked to, if I can't do my research and my visa is only for this period and my funding is only for this period, how is that going to impact? Because now they may have to incur extra visa costs because they may have to extend their visa, or they might have been at the end of their process, end of the PhDs, and they had to apply for the extensions. But again, so their education and studies are directly impacted by the visa, and migration policies. But similarly, the migration policies or the migration practices were also being shaped by the different needs and demands of students and universities. In that is all of a sudden everyone needed, extensions in different ways. And then the actual processing of those extensions has been an issue. So much so as one of the respondents said they had to go to the MP to actually try and get some of these things processed. The other impact of this has been in that delayed education and delays in being able to complete their studies, but also potentially delay in the post-study period. So those who might have been in the process of saying, actually, we're going to apply for post-study programs which start in 2021, that itself is, migration rules, and may have had certain strategies and plans around it. Now we're stuck saying, well, actually, I don't know if these plans will hold. I don't know if I'll be eligible to apply for these post-studies things. So students, international students particularly, had a whole host of questions and concerns that were urgent to them because that impacted a future life trajectory, but also the future migration and mobility plans, which none of the universities considered, none of visa, UK and Home Office didn't consider. So there's a level of uncertainty that international students have had to deal with. So by the time we ran the survey in August, September, one of the things we asked them are, based on your experiences of the lockdown, what are your intentions? What were your intentions before the lockdown post-study? And what were your intentions after the first lockdown in the study? And it wasn't necessarily surprising to see that one of the biggest differences was in finding the jobs in the country of study. And that dropped significantly from 53% to 44%. And then finding a job in the home country or returning to the home country raised slightly more, but that in itself, from 13 to 16. But really, it was a third country group. So going and finding a job in another part of the world, whatever that might be, also received an increase, right? So it was an interesting bit to see how that shifted. So while on one hand, around that time in August, September, there was a narrative of, actually, we don't have to worry about international students. We're still getting a lot of international students coming in, and we don't have to worry about the implications for the economy and universities. But simultaneously, the results and the interviews and the discussions that we were having were showing something completely different. And so, that comes, part of that was, I guess, an optimism on the government's and the university's part, and potentially cynicism on our part, but also really reflection and thinking and entanglements, because all of a sudden you also have a global economic crisis occurring, which is going to impact people's ability to travel and people's ability to pay international fees. And also the desire, the stresses that are being incurred, and the desire of people to actually go back and spend time with their families and go work, and issues around caring for parents and aging, all of those things come into play as to where the jobs are also come into play, right? Because this is about knowledge, and where would the knowledge and qualifications that they're recruiting, that they're acquiring, will be acknowledged, where that might enable them to enter and secure jobs that would provide them with some sense of safety as well. So so it's not just about the infrastructures of knowledge here and the implications of just for education and training, but really what does that mean in terms of thinking through the life courses, in terms of the infrastructures of migration, and the various other entanglements and complexities that they occur, which eventually starts with and also ends into the finance. So we started, when I first started the discussion, really it was trying to think through negative remittances, which refers to the direct and indirect costs that international students incur. So the tuition fees being the example of a direct cost, and indirect costs being housing, food, anything that goes into the local economy of those components. What it also includes is the cost of travel. And the cost of travel, not just buying the flights, but the cost of incurring costs for visa extensions was also added on. For international students, a lot of these funds really are, international students are predominantly self-funded. There's this narrative that international students are privileged, that seems to have, colonial inheritances and linkages around who this international student is, who is often, still assumed to be a man, and then somehow they're still continue to be privileged and part of somehow the transnational capital class. But there's one thing that's become really evident if you're following on international students news during the pandemic, is the idea that recognizing that this privilege that is continuously reported, that some of these students are privileged, isn't in fact, the reality isn't that they're privileged. They're not really rich and they're not very affluent. Yes, there will be a group that's rich and affluent, but that's also the case for home students, as we know, and the class differentiation. But majority are still self-funded. They are funded through family and friends. They might be funded through certain bank loans, which is fewer group of people, but really it does come down to social networks and family relationships. And recently a paper being published, which really looks at the infrastructures of the family relationships and how the challenges of COVID have been managed, right? So all of this is not just separately about migration or migration entangled with knowledge and infrastructures or the financial infrastructures, but they're all embedded within the social and cultural relationships, which are in fact stretched and under increasing stress levels over the past year. And so the desire to then say, to actually leave the UK and go back to their friends and families, or wherever you're studying, is linked to also the ability of being able to do that financially. Are you able to buy that flight? Are you able to say, actually, I'm going to just accept that I'm going to pay rent on a flat that I might not be living in, but I will take the chance and go and visit my family and spend, whatever version lockdown is closer to them, rather than being in the UK by myself. Are students, or as some of the people whom I interviewed, able to also deal with the fact that all of a sudden some people found themselves without places to live because the landlords tried to undertake some unfair practices? Or in one case, where one person was kicked out and they were told, well, actually, we don't really care, these rules don't matter because you're an international student, not a citizen, and therefore the rules around what landlords can do during the situation don't apply to you. And because there isn't necessarily anyone else to confer to, because we're in the middle of a pandemic, the students end up either relying on the generosity of their friends or potentially homeless, because they can't afford to all of a sudden go to a hotel. But also at the same time, we're in a lockdown, so some of the hotels might not even be available unless you're willing to incur significant costs. So the sources of funding, as what they're, relying on friends and family to pay fees and the basic living expense is one thing, but then having to rely on them to incur the costs during lockdown and the pandemic related costs were another thing. And that's raised significant issues, so much so that some people have choose to say, well, I have only this much money left, and I'm going to use this little bit of money to take the flight home because I can't afford to actually live here. I can't afford to pay rent because I've lost my part-time job, or I can't afford to have food because I've lost my part-time job, or I'm having to incur these extra expenses. Or in some cases where people have actually ended up in hospital with COVID, and then, trying to manage the financial implications and as simultaneously managing the migration implications around having to manage the visas. And then at the same time, trying to manage the research implications in the studies because the research has fallen apart, or they might be stuck somewhere who's doing that. Really trying to balance these complexities around, from this international student perspective. On top of all of that, especially when we think about in financial infrastructures, is the ability for the money to move and the ease with which the money can move. Because some people might be coming from countries where their financial infrastructures and financial systems are not as easily linked to the UK and global financial systems. So transferring money from one place to another isn't as easy. There are issues around currency exchange rates. That means that when money, all of a sudden, depending on how the pound was doing, because we also had the issue of Brexit and the impact of economy and the pound values changing, that the money that might have been worth significantly more a couple of months before is no longer worth the same amount. And now that there is intense need for that money, all of these all these issues come together when you think about the finance, migration, and education. And that's from the perspective of the international students who are trying to manage this and trying to resolve and seeing if they can stay in the country, if they're not violating any regulations, because they are unable to attend face-to-face training, or they've missed certain classes because they've had to be admitted to the hospital for COVID. So trying to manage these entanglements. But the other side of the finance, migration, and knowledge are the UK HEIs themselves, right? So what's become really evident throughout this pandemic is the dependence that UK higher education institutions have on international students to provide revenue for them. So in 2014, 2015, international students and fees from international students really accounted for about 14% of the total university income. So this was across all the institutions in the UK. In 2018 and 2019, this was estimated to have increased to about 20%. And that's a very general, a very rough figure based on 2 or 3 reports that were published. But that range is really wide because it depends on the type of institution it is. So a report that was just published in 2020 by London Economics, who are in fact, trying to map out what the implications of COVID has been or will be, is that nearly £100 million worth of money was put into, in 2018, 2019, was injected into UK institutions through EU domiciled and non-EU domiciled international students. bearing in mind that the EU domiciled students have a significantly lower, at that point in 2018-2019, were paying the same fees rates as UK home students, but also they're a much smaller number compared to the non-EU domiciled students who are paying significantly more. Right, so the undergraduates, whereas the EU students would pay, let's say, £9,250, which is the same UK students rate. For the non-EUs, it could vary between £10,000 to £38,000 for undergraduate. And for postgraduate, it could vary for £12,000 to £27,000 based on whether it's lab or it's not, whether it's a STEM course or it's not a STEM, all of these variations need to be taken into consideration. And that's a significant amount of money. And that for particularly the Russell Group institutions, as the report just said, about 50% of the total tuition fee income comes to this, 54% from EU domiciled and non-EU domiciled. And the reason to include EU domiciled in this analysis is that the EU students now will be becoming international students. We don't know, all of those things are being fleshed out. So £100 million or 54% of income, total tuition fee income was from international students. For 1994 groups and the other institutions, that figure was at the other end, which is about 17 to 18%. So that gives you a range of how dependent of higher education institutions are on international student money. The map on this side you'll see really shows the concentration of international students. And at one point, while someone would have thought that maybe they're going to be based predominantly London or the Southeast, and they are, about 30% of international students are around the Southeast and focused on London, but really it's spread widely across the entire, all of UK, right? So you can see anywhere from 15,000 to 5,000 students, the range being, and just across all the institutions in the UK. It's not to one versus the other, but it's across all the institutions. And so when you have that level of dependency, the immediate concern of the universities are, well, how do we resolve this? And there hasn't been necessarily the resolution that's come out yet, but there has been a recognition. There was a recognition immediately of this dependency. And there continues to be discussions around this, but there was also, again, that little optimism around September, October, when the student recruitment numbers were still high, saying, yes, we still have a high number of students recruiting. And then, of course, we were in a lockdown again. The response to that was, well, we'll start by students taking education at a distance and then coming into the UK when they're able to come. And then we've got another lockdown. And so what are those current phases, right? And all of this, the discussion really continued to focus, even in media, on the implications for the HEIs and how this was going to impact their ability to continue operating. As we've seen the cuts that have happened across the board, across the different institutions, not just in the UK, in other, globally in Canada, in the US, in Australia, all of these things, have implications. But in all of that, there was rarely a discussion of the impact on international students and the well-being of international students. It was as if all that mattered briefly for HEIs was getting that money in without actually considering what other support they would need to ensure that international students were supported. What other programs would be needed? What other policies would be needed to ensure that international students who would be coming in and those who are still here have those supports, because international students still don't have those supports. Right? There's some degree where some institutions have said, oh yes, we'll offer mental health and well-being support, but there's been very limited financial support. There's been very limited acknowledgement that there have been challenges on this. That there's some of the international students are locked in halls and there have been no discussions around those. There have been lots of discussions around home students, but again, international students are still somehow embedded and constructed as a privileged group, as if they're being able to take care of themselves because they may have access to their enough resources and enough finances. But that is clearly not the case, and that hasn't yet, that's only just emerging in the discussions, right? It's only just emerging this year in the news reports that's coming out, or the pieces that Guardian's done and cover the other institutions. But what is happening is that, that doesn't mean that the students themselves aren't doing it. And there has been a lot of responses and pushback from students, right? So the Royal College of Arts and Students, the Pass and Pay, There have been fee strikes, there have been, and all of these processes are happening as a way of, as a student's responses to recognizing that they are being left behind, but also that they are in fact stuck in the middle of these entanglements of the migration infrastructures, of the financial infrastructures, and the knowledge infrastructures. They're stuck in between the universities and having to deal with the Home Office and having to deal with the banks and the loans, while simultaneously managing with their parents and family members who are across the world, having to rely in lots of cases on family members to send money in. And without that support, they may be stuck because they can't leave, because they can't afford to leave, but they also can't afford to stay in cases. And so now there are different support systems that are emerging from international students themselves. But again, very little support of the infrastructure that exists on the receiving country sides are so limited. And that's what's been shown, is the gap as to where those failures are. That you could have the migration visa, you could have visas and policies and everything that'll get you to the UK, but then sometimes you can't actually physically get to it. So we have the infrastructures, which are all about facilitating these different things, but the outcomes have not been taken into consideration. And that's what Lindquist and Young have really, talk about the infrastructuralization. So we put all these processes and put all these procedures in place. But what are the actual outcomes of putting those processes and procedures in place? Are students actually getting the education, the quality of education? How do we ensure that? How do we take that into consideration? And really, as we are in the middle of, continue to be in the middle of the crisis, while in the UK, yes, we can say that we are going to be coming out of lockdowns and the stage processes. The universities have taken a particular approach, or the government's also taking a very particular approach, but the crisis continues. And this is as of this morning, as I was just finishing off the presentation, where the rates in India have really significantly gone up. Just that spike, as you see, just within the last week, the numbers have really, really gone up. And Chris Holds, who's, works quite a bit on international students and education, posted this tweet in the morning, which was that there's a major crisis for all of our international students from India who are living at the, and he's based in the US. So we have to take this into account, that what are the implications of something happening? Yes, it's India and it's far away, and they're having, a surge, and we're not having to deal with the surge because we've got vaccinations rolling out. But there are still international students who are still stuck here and maybe unable to go back to India. India's just been put on the red list, I believe, for the UK. So there are students who might have now paid their tuition fees to come into the UK for the next session, or might have been considering international, coming into the UK to study, will be unable to do so, because there'll be a whole host of other costs that are incurred. There might be whole visa issues and consular services that they may be able to undertake, they may not be able to access. There'll be language testing centers which may no longer be available. So we need to recognize that this is a continuing crisis. Yes, the pandemic in itself is a continuing crisis, but when we're going to think about international students, is within the context and the complexities and entanglements of these different infrastructures. It isn't just someone moving from one place to another, doing their bit of education and then going back, but really it is all the negotiations that need to occur, and the structures that they're dealing with, all the consular services, the travel restrictions and the travel requirements, the studying at a distance, which in itself, and learning at a distance, which in itself is a completely different way of learning. Yes, we've done this for a year, but that doesn't necessarily mean that students are used to it. And then the financial implications, because that needs to continue on, needs reflections in certain ways. But an awareness that there are financial implications and there are financial infrastructures that are entangled with the universities. And they're entangled in a way that differentially benefits universities, but also differentially impacts students. And while they might be beneficial for one group, which is, in international student terms, there's a supply side and demand side of this equation. So while they may, benefit the universities, they may not be beneficial or as easy to manage for international students and the students themselves. And yet there's very little sometimes consideration on how to support those international students. So the question that arises is, if we want to continue having international students and continue to treat them as cash cows, as that's how they've been treated repeatedly for decades on, well then, how do you do this ethically? You need to recognize that they've been treated in very unfair ways. And if this is what we want to do, which is we want to continue to recruit international students because our higher education system is entirely dependent on them and cross-subsidized education of the home students, how do you do this ethically? How do you ensure that this happens without, without a detrimental impact on the students as they're entangled in these infrastructures of migration, finance, and knowledge? And so on that point, I think I'll conclude. Thank you so very much for that.
Thank you so much, Gunjan, for this amazing presentation. And it's very, like a timely and important topic as we discuss about the modes of instruction for the following academic year and how we will deliver our teaching and so on. So thank you so much. It was really relevant. And I have quite a number of questions for you, but before I ask my own questions, I wanna ask the audience. So if you have any questions, we're not many people, so can you just unmute yourself? I know that we have a couple of comments in the chat, but can you unmute yourselves and ask your question if anyone has anything? Okay, so as people, think about the questions that I want to ask, I think
there are questions in the chat as well.
I think there's one comment from Maru saying that if you include EU students, there is a restriction preventing them to go back home as they are not allowed to cancel their studies abroad to come back later. And she says they would lose the opportunity to benefit from Erasmus program and fundings. But I think when the Brexit happened, the Erasmus program is no longer in place anyway. No?
Okay, I didn't realize that it was already over. Okay.
I think they're coming up with a touring scheme. I believe that's what it was. I could be wrong. Yeah.
Okay. I know in my country, it's one of the issue. Like some of them would like to go back to their countries, but they're just stuck because they won't have any opportunity to come back later anyway.
Yeah, no, you're right. So I have a comment and a question to actually ask. So, when this first pandemic started, there was a huge concern about the number of international students. And last year, I think that was the case with the many universities where they were discussing, the international number of students will decrease and then we'll lose them. That will put us a huge financial risk. But what this academic year showed us that actually, please correct me if I'm wrong, that the UK received a record number of international applications and students, and which wasn't the case. And I was wondering whether this lack of support for international students has something to do with this idea that, well, the international students will come to the UK no matter what.
Yeah. I mean, yes. So, just precisely in September, as we were doing a lot of this, as we were doing the interviews with these students and in the midst of these surveys, yes, the reports that all of a sudden, we don't have to worry about it because the international students are still coming. That's great, but they're not necessarily still coming in. And this is still short term. I think what it showed is a lack of really forethought and foresight into it. Right? So what are the implications of having to undertake education at a distance? Not when you're already enrolled at a distance education institution, such as the OU, or, in your case as well, and the work they sometimes do. But it's, when you have, if you're enrolled and you're paying for the LSE or SOAS or Imperial and having to do this at a distance, or sitting in your halls down the street and not being able to, do that has implications. Because international students aren't just coming for the education, right? There is the whole experience around it. It isn't just the knowledge infrastructures are not just about the HEI and the education, the formality and the formal spaces. It's all the other space and the networking and the social and the informal spaces of learning. And when you remove the informal spaces of learning and all the other things that come with being at a higher education institution as an international student, those are not the things that people have really considered or experienced yet, right? So there might be a knock-on effect where people who are having to undertake these at a distance are in fact telling students, well, actually, maybe this is not worth it. We don't know what those implications are. We don't know. So all we have is a very optimistic view of, oh yes, we've got great numbers recruited right now, so that's great. but without, and as you said, it's precisely that, right? It's UK, students will still come. We don't have to do anything about it. So yes, we can continue on with it, and universities can continue on with this. But as part of the university agenda, it ought to be somewhat of an ethical consideration, right? If you want to do this, especially now when universities are claiming to try and do decolonizing the universities and anti-racism agendas, which as we all know is all lip service anyways, that ethical responsibility becomes part of it.
No, definitely right. I have a couple of questions for myself as well, but before that, I'll ask Kyunmi's question. And she was wondering if you have any thoughts about distance and online international students. Kyunmi, maybe you might need to, unmute yourself and ask about. Kyunmi has this amazing article that I recommend everyone to read about. I think it was she was conceptualizing 4 different typology of distance students. Yeah, so I think that's just like very relevant to you. Over to you, Kyunmi.
Thank you. Thanks for presentation. I really enjoy it. Thanks. I'm just wondering, because like I was kind of somehow expecting, because you were working for Open University, I was expecting to have some sort of your conversation about international students who are doing it in their own countries at Open University, but it was kind of physically bounded in terms of your conversation today. So I was wondering if you, slightly different topic, but if you have any thoughts about a potential, I don't know, I would say damage / benefits for this particular group of online international students whose number has been grown dramatically recent years. So any thoughts will be welcome, and I'll be interested.
It's a shame Parvati's not here, because so this, we've been doing this paper together. Well, Melissa is here, so, but their previous project, or their last project, the Ideas project, was about looking at, component of that was looking at international distance education. And so their paper, The Infrastructures of Mobility, which is partly as part of this conversation, looks at how it in fact enables people to not move because people don't want to move. The OU case is interesting in that the OU doesn't actually have a lot of international students. They've never really had an international agenda. So it was precisely as we were preparing for, started looking at during the pandemic and looking at the implications. Because yes, there are PhD students in geography who are international students, but most of them were already based in Milton Keynes or around there, because international students have, the requirements there. But then we have 2 students who were on field site, and one of them was in Ghana. Who was just stuck there. So the question wasn't necessarily around distance education of PhD students, but around the research and being stuck on site, which, in that case, it was very similar to every other PhD student who was on site trying to do research. But it does, so while formally I interviewed one person who had already started their new, I can't remember which institution they were now based at. They had started the new program, the master's program that they had enrolled in with the UK university, and they had already started doing it at a distance because it was September, October. So that module had already, course started. But informally, there's a whole host of people that, we were just chatting, who were doing things at a distance. I have colleagues in other departments who have been recruited, who are still sitting in Canada and other parts of the world, not being able to come into the UK and trying to do, working on research and things. And I think there is an idea of what there's an idea of what distance education has been that permeates everyone's ideas. And that makes people reluctant to pursue distance education, just because the notion of distance education, what it is. However, and also how that translates, right? So I'm being told, especially as I talk to people about how they're able to transition or enter the labor market after studying abroad, particularly in Asia. And while most of the people I spoke to were based in China, but not just specifically China, right? Across all Asian countries, India, Southeast Asia, East Asia broadly, is that employers do not recognize distance learning institutions unless it's that one. So in India, the Indira Gandhi Open University is recognized. In South Africa, UNISA or across Africa is recognized, but they don't recognize any other way. And even with international education, unless it's an actually prominent name that's recognized within their networks. Not just that's an US universities like Ivy League universities, Brown and stuff. Yes, they're popular, but unless they're recognized in their actual networks of people who are hiring, those names mean nothing in lots of ways, right? That education, that degree from abroad does not mean anything unless it's recognized within spaces and within networks. So the students may take on the international distance education, but if the employers don't recognize it, no one's going to do it after the fact. But we don't know yet how the employers are going to respond to this, right? Because we haven't had enough of a cohort. But this is me just hypothesizing based on some of the other international education and international student experiences. But there are other ways. So because I'm currently chairing module production of a research methods course, a dissertation course in geography at the OU, and how we think about skills and how we think about the training, how we think around all of that. If that's actually thought through and the modules are produced and that recognition is put through to the employers, yes. I think that's the key thing that we need to keep in mind is the recognition of the employers. Regardless of what we think education for the sake of education is important, lots of people are doing this because they want to get a job and want to get a job in certain spaces. So would the employers recognize it? The Open University is recognized in the UK, yes. Is the Open University recognized outside the UK? Less likely so.
Okay, I mean, that's really interesting because I didn't know that. But basically, let's just hope, or I don't know, at least for me as a distance educator, I hope that this pandemic will change other countries' recognitions, that they will more highly recognize, appreciate Open University, for example. That would be great. But all right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kimi. And do we have any other questions? Because I have something. Yeah.
Maybe I have one question about the entire student experience, from the problem with the visa to the housing and all the rest. What do you feel are like the biggest problem for international students in this pandemic?
I think if I had to create sort of a ranking, the visas.
Oh yeah? Okay.
Over the money, over all of those things, because your ability to stay in the country as international migrants is dependent on your status as how good of a migrant you are. Yeah. So if you're ever deported out of a country, that's put as, you all of a sudden get veered on. Your status as a migrant and your ability to maintain your status as a good migrant impacts your ability to move globally. It impacts your ability to come back into the UK. It impacts your ability to go to the US or any other part of the world, right? Because once you're there's a check mark blacklist on your travel records, that's going to impact wherever you are. Yes, every country has their own little lovely list that we all somehow randomly get selected to be security checked. But there are certain things that are linked to your passport. And that, I think, the key thing, right? So yes, you may pause your studies. Yes, it might incur that you might lose some money, but does pausing your study also mean that you violated your visa restriction? And does that mean that you will not be able to get another visa to continue studying or get a visa to work? That becomes a consideration, right? So violating visa consideration. So the very first immediate concern for students was, I'm violating my visa requirements because I can't do face-to-face. I can't go in. Am I going to be marked absent? My technology is failing. I don't have internet. Am I going to be counted as absent or present in it? Because universities play that border agents roles. Yeah. So the universities have, it's not just about how to take care of international students, it's to recognize that they're complicit in a very particular infrastructure and that hostile environment that the UK has.
I see. Thank you. Do you feel like the international students were like more isolated than the local students, for example, as well?
Yeah, I mean, even home students, regardless of what the regulations are, can go home, so to speak. They have social networks, right? So if you're, and it's not just an international student issue, it's a migrant thing as well, right? So if you're traveling somewhere temporarily, because that's how international students are perceived to be continuously in a state of temporariness, and until even with a post-study program that we have in place, the assumption is that they will return. So if you talk to people who've gone through certain hearings around deportation, you know, this assumption that you're not building a life for yourself in the UK. If you've dared build a life for yourself in the UK, being on a temporary visa, you have committed an offence and therefore you should be kicked out. You know, so there's a whole hostile environment and a migration infrastructure that prevents a lot, you know, that shapes these interactions that we need to keep in mind when we think of international students. Because the migration component has always been hidden and the financial component has always been hidden. They've always been put as internationalization or education.
Yeah.
And we need to sort of look at the entanglements of those three.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any other questions? Because I have one question, and then if no one has any other questions, we can, yeah.
I can ask one more if that's
Yes,
okay,
course,
Melis.
yes.
Can I interject? All right, so my question is, okay, so I published this one paper. So what I have done exactly kind of as it happened, you know, as many other researchers have done, we did a little survey at Lancaster University and also Korean University in South Korea. And we tried to kind of compare during the students' experiences during the first semester, so between March and June. So we did survey across July and August to see. And what happened was that actually international students' satisfactory rate in terms of their online learning experience were so much higher than domestic students, according to I mean, it's like, of course, like, it really depends on how instructor tackle and how university. But one thing I noticed probably relevant to your presentation is that South Korea especially, they kicked out all the international students. But like kicked out is a bit strong word, but they let them go home and be with their family when these things happen as early as possible, because they saw it as like global pandemic. And so entire institutions was letting students. So what happened was international student at Korean University went home, so they didn't have to stuck in South Korea, but they did online. And then they were actually quite happier than domestic students. They were like, they really appreciate the university tried to pivot their lectures, everything is, and they find it very convenient and nice to spend time with their family and so on. So yeah, so that's what I reported in my publication. It's not very, probably it's very small study, but I just wondering, I mean, that could be the case as well. So probably it would be nice to kind of listen to your thoughts. Maybe the best way for us to tackle it, probably we could have just let them go home and then forget about this visa issue maybe, and then student may have better well-being status.
So I definitely want to read that paper because that sounds really, I mean, for lots of reasons. But I think what it also shows, what it shows is South Korea's experience. I mean, as we all know, despite UK and US and everyone else ignoring all of the East Asian countries, that their response has been very particular because of the experience of how to manage pandemics, especially from the last with SARS. And the response in sending students home as compared to Australia's version of sending students home, which is, we need you to get out, as opposed to, you should go home and this will not have bearing, right? There is a very particular, so not being as familiar with South Korean universities, there is a very particular sensitivity towards the well-being of the population. I mean, that's evident in the response from South Korea, right? So there's a particular responsibility of the government to ensure that the citizens were being taken care of in very particular ways. That's been different in the UK and various other things. But then also being aware and managing simultaneously the entanglements of those infrastructures, right? So it's not just, oh, you need to go home as a university, say, well, if you want to go home, you can go home and that's fine, and we'll do it at a distance. But what the implications are for migration, right? So you can't just send people home. You have to say you can go home and this will not have a bearing on your migration status. And then people will be like, yes, brilliant. We'll just come back and pick it up potentially. And that would be a brilliant response, right? That would be great to consider as a future way forward. But again, as the UK has shown, it doesn't like to learn from any country that's an OECD country. If it was at one point not a first world country, there's the learning from the global south, despite it not, being a developed nation, that the global north countries do not like to take into consideration, right? So despite the brilliant lessons that could be learned. So there is that, but I think part of that is also the different demographics and composition of the international students. So I can't remember off the top of my head what the numbers are and where the consenting countries are, but it could also be those. So yes, there's also going to be the intra-Asian mobility, but also increasingly from the US coming into it. But then there's also the diasporic flows as well. So it's linked to the complexities of all of those entanglements. But yeah, I mean, I'd love to hear more about it and, definitely chat more about it. It sounds brilliant.
That would be great. Thank you.
Thanks, me. We have a question, sort of a comment and a question in the chat box from Rosie Flevet, who says that I joined this fascinating session a little late due to a meeting clash, and this is not my area of research expertise, but as a postgraduate teacher and supervisor, I'm really interested to read more about this, and can you give any recommendations for papers?
On international students, for international students in COVID, or I mean, it's massive. As Kyung-Mi said, there's a whole. It's fortunately now, as opposed to before, it's a growing field and it's getting increasingly complex that recognizes the complexities. And I've just, as Kyung-Mi said, as I've really only looked at a very small portion of it, and that's also from a UK perspective. But there is, depending on the regional focus that you do, and one of the other projects we're doing is looking at looking at international student mobility in Africa, so the intra-African student mobility, and that would be that's a whole another body. Hopefully that will be emerging, and we're trying to bring that out further. But yeah, so my work at gender and international student migration, and in that particular context, it was India. We're looking at through gender and space and my internet connection's unstable, it says. Through that, but there's also work that Parvati Raghuram and has done, and we've just done a couple of handbook chapters recently. But the existing body of work, who's currently based.
There's
a whole set of the references as well.
Okay. We lost you there for a little bit, but you're back again, I guess.
Okay. Yeah, it said briefly that my internet connection was unstable. So
actually, so I can you hear me? Okay, we can't hear you, but anyway, I'll ask. Yeah. So
maybe if you can turn off the camera for a second, it will get better. The sound will get better.
Let me do it as well. Okay. Gunjan, can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, okay, perfect. So you briefly touched on this, but one of the things that I want to ask is just drawing on the research that you have done over the summertime, the surveys and so on, and you talk about different complexities for the international students during this COVID times. But I was wondering if there's any particular geographical disparities that you have identified. The reason why I'm asking is that it seems like in the UK there are certain international student markets, like China is a big one. I'm sorry that I'm saying it markets, but that's how it's basically taken up in the literature. And there was a huge, as I said, a worry about that this may switch into to this student potential may be lost to the US or Australia. So I was wondering if there are any particular geographical disparities in the way that these international students experience different difficulties during COVID times, or did certain geographical, particular countries or particular geographies, that they receive particular or any kind of privileged or preferential treatment or support from the UK? Because most of the time, the international students, when the university is recruiting international students or the agencies, they have certain, as I said, markets or countries that they are going for.
Yeah. No, I mean, yes, India and China are the largest markets for the UK, right? There's no question about that. And globally. those are the two largest international student markets, and China increasingly also becoming the site for students coming into China. So I think depending on what numbers you look at, China is potentially ranked as the 4th now largest receiving country of international students as well. So in this case, what the geographical variability was linked to when a country went into lockdown. So China being the very first, amongst the first ones to go into lockdown, which meant, or at least, you know, in the interviews that I did, I was speaking to one person whose colleague went home sort of for Christmas and hopes of staying on for Chinese New Year in 2019 with December, and didn't actually manage to re-enter the UK until August 2020, right? So another student, and they couldn't do anything because you were just stuck, because you had to, or you had to, you know, there was just no infrastructure, nothing to actually leave the sites that you were in. So you may have wanted to come back to the UK, but if there were no buses traveling, or, you know, if there were no flights out of it, you couldn't actually physically come to the UK, or you couldn't leave the countries that you were, or the regions you were coming from. And similar with India, right? So the lockdown and in fact, I'm more aware of the India one because I was supposed to have a launch of a report in India, and in March 2020, and that we were told that the event was cancelled. Like 6 hours before I was supposed to leave, I was at home, packed, and I'm just like, am I going to the airport? Could you tell me if I'm getting to the airport? They're like, no, we're cancelling the event. Don't go to the airport. Just cancel your flights, whatever, right? And within those 3 days, India was going into lockdown. And then there's also the issue of the airports that we hadn't considered, which is, you know, you could have left a country, but you couldn't enter another country. You might be stuck at an airport, or you could be transitioning from airports, because all of a sudden I would have had to change flights in Dubai, I think, and all of a sudden there were issues around there, right? So I could have left the UK and it would have been fine for me to enter India for some reason. But because I had transitioned from another airport potentially, that meant I may not have been able to enter, because all of a sudden the countries were being, you know. So there's this whole infrastructure of mobility and travel and migration that intersected with, you know, securitization. That's what is happening now, is a securitization of health and migration that gets entangled with all of this. So I think that was more the geographical variability and the levels of lockdown, as opposed to, you know, just leaving country.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. No, thank you so much, Gunjan. So Kinmi shared the article that she was talking about, and that's the one that you've been talking, right? Kinmi, the one you wrote about student learning and COVID-19. And I strongly, you know, like recommend anyone to read it. It looks into student experiences during COVID. Do we have any other questions? I just want to ask if we have any questions, people can unmute themselves. If not, I will be ending the session then, and would like to thank Gunjan a lot for this, you know, fascinating, exciting, and also very timely conversation and presentation. I mean, it's just like it concerns all of us as we are in this higher education sector, how we enhance our students' learning experiences, as long as, you know, also how we make our international students experiences more actually easier during times of COVID. So Gunjan, do you want to say anything as a close up?
Just to say thank you so much for the questions and the opportunity to really, as I said, it's the first time we've publicly sort of shared some of this information, the findings and the data from this. So, you know, and for bearing with me as we think through and resolve through some of these ideas and thoughts that we've tried to put together in this paper. So thank you so much for this. Really appreciate it. It's been brilliant.
Well, thank you, Gunjan, for you know, your time and for this conversations. So everyone. The next online seminar our next online seminar will take place on Wednesday, 28th of April. That's next week, and it will be presented by Dr. Sharon Clarence from Rhodes University in South Africa. And the title of the presentation is "How do we turn access into success, creating spaces for socially just teaching?" So it will be again very much a nice continuation of the debates that we have started today. So we all look forward to meeting you next week again here at the same hours. So until then, take care. Bye-bye.